billionaire found three identical boys who looked just like him in a park. When he saw who they were with, he was paralyzed with shock. In the past, Michael Solar had achieved what many would never dare even to dream of. He was the owner of one of the most powerful companies in the region, a firm that spanned multiple markets and had consolidated over the years with relentless success. The fortune he had amassed not only guaranteed him a spot in the financial pages of the most prestigious newspapers, but also gave him access to the most exclusive circles, dinners with magnates, philanthropic events in grand ballrooms, private jet travel, and stays in luxury hotels where nothing was out of reach. Yet all that opulence was not enough to illuminate the dark inner shadow that accompanied him. Despite all his conquests, Michael did not experience the joy one might expect from someone so powerful. On the contrary, each achievement was a reminder of the unfathomable loneliness that surrounded him. He lived in a mansion perched on the hills, an imposing structure surrounded by meticulously tended gardens. Walking through those halls, one perceived a silence so heavy it bordered on oppressive. The walls were adorned with artworks of incalculable value, unique sculptures, paintings by great masters, Persian rugs, and antiques that told stories of a distant past. However, despite the exquisiteness around him, Michael found these objects to be nothing more than meaningless ornaments. Neither the Greek sculptures nor the Renaissance paintings could fill the emptiness he felt deep within his soul. They were, at heart, a mute echo of his own status, beautiful, costly, rare, yet incapable of conveying human warmth. At night, when the city lights shimmered in the distance and the fresh hillside breeze cooled the air, Michael wandered slowly through his home. Rooms that were spacious and bright during the day turned into dim caverns by night. His footsteps echoed over marble and polished wood floors. His steps were the only sound clearly heard. There were no children's laughter, no friends' voices sharing anecdotes, no gentle murmur of conversation at dinner time. There was only him, his breathing, and the echo of a seemingly perfect life devoid of any emotional bond. Michael's family relationships were a delicate matter. His mother had passed away when he was still very young, leaving a wound that never fully healed. Her memory lived on in a black and white photograph he kept in an office at the far end of the mansion. There, his mother's figure smiled with a warmth that found no continuation in his father. That man, head always bent over papers, immersed in endless meetings and busy accumulating fortunes without noticing the emotional distance, had never been a close figure. As a result, Michael grew up with a cold, rational understanding of the world. He saw people as chess pieces on a corporate board, as allies or adversaries, never pausing to know their hearts. The lack of paternal love, combined with the absence of a mother, turned him into a closed-off individual, unable to recognize the value of a sincere hug or the importance of an encouraging word. He had no children, no wife, no true friends. The women who had passed through his life were mostly fleeting figures, seduced by his wealth and status, not by him as a person. His employees, perfectly trained, maintained a respectful distance. They knew facing their boss's temperament could be dangerous. Michael was known for his excessive demands and his impatience with others' mistakes. Despite being a man who had built a fortune almost from scratch, he lacked the empathy needed to understand the daily struggles of those who worked for him. From his subordinates' perspective, Michael was a sort of distant god, powerful and untouchable, whose orders were followed without question and whom they dared not displease. Those relationships were purely professional, never friendly, built more on fear than on authentic respect. His routine was as static as it was predictable. At dawn, a call from his personal assistant reminded him of the first meeting of the day. Then a driver took him to his impressive office in the city's tallest skyscraper. There, in a suite with panoramic windows, Michael daily observed the human anthill sprawling in the streets below. His investment firm moved astronomical sums, set market trends, and dictated the direction of multi-million-dollar projects. Meetings with executives, lunches with partners, signing contracts upon contracts. Between sips of the finest wines in Michelin-starred restaurants, Michael fed his ego. Yet when the clock signaled the end of the workday and he returned home, what awaited him was a silence that hurt. Sometimes, while sipping cognac in his main lounge, he tried to make sense of it all. He had achieved what many dreamed of. His name was linked to success, his fortune multiplied, and doors opened before him effortlessly. However, not a single close voice knew of his fears, doubts, or fatigue. He had never felt the warm trust of a confidant, nor the genuine joy of sharing an achievement with someone who wanted nothing in return. His nights ended at the edge of his bed, eyes lost, wondering what had gone wrong, why money, which could buy everything, couldn't purchase something as basic as inner peace. While the city slept, Michael felt trapped in a gigantic golden cage he had built with his own hands. He had sacrificed relationships, illusions, and affections in pursuit of financial success, without understanding that emotional deficiencies accumulate over time, and that in the end, no matter how much luxury surrounded him, nothing could change the fact that he was alone. Somewhere in the world, people laughed, loved, suffered together, shared secrets and hopes. But in his mansion, the only language spoken was silence, and the echo of his own voice was not enough to fool him about the hollow quality of his existence. At that stage of his life, Michael did not know love, the warmth of an embrace, the tenderness of an honest kiss, nor the authentic joy of a shared moment. He had built a kingdom of opulence, but his throne was encircled by emotional deserts. He did not yet know that in time, something would shake the foundations of that hollow existence. For now, he remained trapped in his routine, locked into his material vision of success, without imagining that fate would soon present him with a truth that would change his life forever. That afternoon, Michael had left the office feeling a strange sensation in his chest. He had left behind a day filled with empty meetings and debates about numbers, percentages, and market trends. He had departed earlier than usual, giving a few final instructions to his assistant and asking that the remaining appointments on his schedule be cancelled. He felt a different kind of weariness, not the physical fatigue of someone who works too much, but that internal depletion, that imperative need to breathe fresh air, to escape the constant murmur of money and strategies, and for a moment, forget he was one of the most powerful men in the city. He headed to a park not far from his office. It was a modest place, almost insignificant compared to the luxury he was accustomed to. Not the sort of private garden expected in his circles, but a public park where anyone could sit on a bench and watch people come and go. There were lush groves, gravel paths, children playing, couples chatting softly, and elderly folks who gathered to talk about their youthful days. Without fully knowing why, Michael felt drawn to that simple, nearly humble atmosphere. Perhaps it provided the contrast he needed. As he ventured among the trees, he felt the fresh caress of the wind on his face. It was late afternoon. The sun was descending and painting the sky in soft hues. The light, a blend of gold and orange, filtered through the leaves, creating glimmers on the grass. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and damp earth, a scent Michael rarely appreciated. He walked slowly, without a clear destination, just letting himself drift, sensing how, step by step, his tension eased. For the first time in a long while, he saw himself without the armor of the businessman. There, among trunks and breezes, he was just another person in search of a peaceful moment. As he continued, he began to notice sounds not usually part of his routine. The distant song of a bird, the high, carefree laughter of a child, the creak of branches swaying in the wind. In those moments, his mind emptied of the worries that had robbed him of sleep the night before. He left behind contract clauses, marketing strategies, and long-term projects to focus on the textures and nuances of that small oasis of green amid the city. Then, when he turned onto a path that led to a more secluded corner, something caught his attention. A few yards away, he saw 3 boys playing together. They could have been brothers, as their resemblance was undeniable. At first, He only noticed their crystalline laughter and youthful energy, but as he got closer, his heart began beating in a peculiar way. There was something strange about those children, something disturbingly familiar. They had the same dark brown hair with coppery highlights as his own. Their posture, the tilt of their heads, the way they tucked their hands into their pockets, everything evoked an image Michael knew all too well. His own. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. How could it be possible that these three boys, almost identical to each other, so closely resembled him in his childhood? He wondered if he was imagining it, if it might be some absurd coincidence. Yet as he drew nearer, the impression only grew stronger. There was something in the way they looked at their surroundings, in those deep eyes the same shade as his own, a dark, autumnal green, that took his breath away. The children also noticed his presence, and instead of being frightened or running away, they remained still, watching him curiously. Michael felt an inner tremor, as if his heart had lost its rhythm. Those eyes, though younger, seemed to reflect a hint of recognition. It was as if that instant suspended time. Michael observed them, frowning, incredulous, trying to find a logical explanation for what he was seeing. They simply looked back, unafraid, without hostility, as though they found in his presence something they could not explain but felt was natural. It was then that a soft, feminine voice broke into this strange scene. A woman stepped out from behind a nearby tree, where she seemed to have been watching the children at play. She approached them calmly and stopped a few steps from Michael. She wore a simple dress, and her expression showed a mix of nervousness and serene determination. Meeting Michael's eyes, she gave a barely perceptible smile. "Good afternoon," she said in a controlled voice. "My name is Martha. I'm a friend of the family." Michael tried to organize his thoughts, but the woman's words only added to his confusion. What family? He did not recall Martha from anywhere. She was neither one of his partners, nor an employee. She wasn't part of his inner circle, non-existent in fact, nor a supplier. He had never heard her name before, yet here she stood, speaking to him with a disquieting familiarity. "Excuse me," Michael murmured, voice somewhat shaky. "I don't know who you are. How do you know my name? Why do you call yourself a friend of the family?" Martha remained calm, although a hint of tension danced in her eyes. She looked at the children, still motionless, their gaze fixed on the man who watched them in astonishment. Then, turning her attention back to Michael, she exhaled slowly before speaking. "Perhaps you don't remember me, Michael. It's been a long time since we last saw each other. I knew your family years ago, under different circumstances. These children you see here..." She paused, looking at each of them with visible affection. "They are yours." The revelation struck Michael like a blow. His legs went weak, and he felt the world around him become unreal. His children. Those boys were his children. The very possibility was so unexpected that his mind refused to accept it. He, who had always lived in isolation, without a real home or family, could he have children? How was it possible that there were three boys identical to him who shared his blood? He wanted to deny the situation, but the evidence was overwhelming. They were his face in a child's version, the reflection of his own genetics embodied in three little bodies who played on, unaware of the emotional earthquake they had just unleashed. Michael, paralyzed, looked at Martha, waiting for some explanation, some story that would clarify how all this had come to pass. While the leaves swayed in the breeze, the revelation hung in the air. Michael realized that his life, previously ordered around material achievements, was now shaken by the presence of three unfamiliar children who shared his face, his gaze, and apparently his blood. Unable to find words, he remained there, gazing at those young faces, feeling how his world both shrank and expanded at once, as if someone had opened a secret door in the labyrinth of his existence. There, in that small corner of the park, Fate had set the most unexpected trap, and nothing would ever be the same. Martha took her time to speak, as though each word required the effort of unearthing a painful memory. They were still in that secluded part of the park, under the shade of a large tree whose branches swayed gently. While the children played a few yards away, now calmer since they had noticed the woman's serious demeanor, she fixed her gaze on Michael, holding it in those eyes that once had fascinated her and now seemed unsure where to rest. "These children are yours, Michael," she said in a firm voice tinged with a hint of melancholy. "They are actually triplets, though people often say twins when they see 3 identical children. They were born 12 years ago, the result of that brief relationship we had when we were still 2 young people without a clear path. Or at least I was without a path, and you had yours set too firmly. I imagine you don't remember me, or if you do, it's barely as a shadow in your memory. Back then, you were an arrogant young man, always talking about your plans, your goals, and the fortune you would build. I was just a woman you met one night at a party with whom you had a short-lived romance lasting only a few weeks." Her words sank into Michael's consciousness like stones thrown into a still pond. He kept his gaze on Martha's face, trying to recognize in her features the young woman he might once have known. It was hard to place her in his past. Maybe at some university party, one of those events he attended to make connections. He vaguely remembered a time when he went out with several women without deepening any relationship, thinking only of himself, his career, and his goal of achieving power and wealth. If Martha was telling the truth, those children had been conceived during that murky, selfish period of his life, when he thought of nothing but his own ascent. "I didn't look for you," she continued, now with a hint of sadness and determination, "because I was convinced you wouldn't want to know about this, that you would never take responsibility. Back then, you were so ambitious and so cold that it seemed unthinkable that you would give anything up or adjust your life for some children. Even so, I didn't hold it against you. I simply thought that the easiest, most sensible thing was to raise these little ones without involving you. I was the one who carried the burden, the sleepless nights, the childhood illnesses, the impossible bills. I devoted myself to being a mother 24 hours a day, gave up opportunities, and made mistakes. But I always wanted to give the children a decent life." Each of Martha's words hit Michael like a blow. He felt his world crumble, not materially, for his fortune, his home, and his business remained intact, but in that intimate, unknown part of himself he had never explored. Children? He? A father? The idea filled him with a mixture of dread and perplexity. How was it possible that during these 12 years he had never known anything about their existence? Had his life been so frenetic and superficial that he never even considered the possibility of having left someone behind like that? He tried to remember Martha more clearly. Perhaps if he strained his memory, he could recall a certain look, a conversation. Yes, there was a blurry face, a young woman with sincere eyes and an easy smile, someone not from his social circle who did not share his ambitions, but who for some reason had captivated him for a few nights. He, so used to measuring people by their usefulness, had found something different in her, the freshness of someone who desired nothing more than a simple life. But that image faded, buried by the decades of triumphs and isolation he had lived through since. "The twins are 12, Martha went on. They've grown up without a father to guide them, without a man to teach them simple things like riding a bike without fear or fixing something around the house. I've done what I could, but life hasn't been easy. I don't have your resources, Michael. I've worked various jobs, none stable, none that assured me a secure future for the children. Sometimes I've asked neighbors for help, other times I got by with what little I earned. And the children, for their part, have grown used to poverty, to not having luxuries, to not expecting expensive gifts or airplane trips. They've learned to be strong with very little." Martha's gaze now showed unwavering determination. She did not accuse him with hateful words, nor insult him, nor even raise her voice. She seemed more tired than angry, as if speaking of a shared responsibility in which he, without knowing, had failed. And Michael, unable to articulate a coherent response, felt himself torn apart inside. How should he react to this? With joy at having children? With anger at having been deceived or at not having known anything? With fear of the new responsibility looming over him? He noticed the children were now closer, observing the scene curiously. The three faces were so similar it was unsettling. They were his living image in miniature, a projection of his face through time. There they were, looking him in the eyes, perhaps expecting a reaction. What could he tell them? Were there any words that could make up for 12 years of absence? They were strangers to him, and yet they carried his blood, his lineage, his very reflection. Seeing Michael's consternation, Martha dared to step closer. She was a woman who, despite the hardships of her life, maintained a certain dignity and tact. She spoke with that same calm sadness. "I'm not asking you for anything, Michael. I haven't come to demand a fortune nor an apology. I only wanted you to know the truth. My situation grows more precarious by the day, and I thought that maybe, if you knew they existed, you might take an interest in their lives. I'm tired of struggling alone. I've carried this secret for far too long." The weight of those words felt like an anchor landing in the center of Michael's chest. He looked at the children with a mixture of shame, confusion, and guilt. Never, in his entire existence, had he imagined that the past would present him with such a personal bill. Until that moment, his life had been a path of solitary triumphs, hollow successes. Now, suddenly, fatherhood appeared before him as an unknown challenge, a door he had never wanted to open. He felt his legs weaken and his vision blur slightly. The air in his lungs seemed to thin, and he sensed a persistent throb in his temples. He would have to say something, make a decision. But for the first time in a very long time, Michael Solar, the confident businessman, the unquestioned magnate, had not the slightest idea what to do. There, in that park, amid the whisper of leaves and the distant murmur of the city, he had just discovered a new dimension of himself, one that struck him with the force of a reality he had so long avoided. The children were his, and nothing would ever be the same. In the days following that terrible revelation, Michael felt as if he were walking a tightrope stretched between two worlds: the orderly, predictable universe he had built with his wealth, and this new, raw, bewildering reality made manifest by the existence of his three children. From the moment Martha had spoken, the words confirming his paternity, something inside him had cracked. The ruthless businessman, the self-assured magnate, the man who always had the answers, was now utterly lost. In his office, morning after morning, Michael sat before the large panoramic window overlooking the city. Meetings took place without his real participation. He nodded mechanically at the words of his executives, but his mind was elsewhere. When he looked out at the metropolis from his skyscraper's height, he no longer saw the familiar landscape of opportunities and markets, but the stage where three children, his children, had grown up without him. Guilt seeped in silently, like a slow poison, reminding him that in those very corners of the city, while he climbed relentlessly up the social ladder, three small lives had forged themselves without his guidance. Despite his confusion, Michael could not deny a strange connection beginning to form when he recalled those children's faces. They were almost identical to one another, unsettling reflections of his own image. When Martha had revealed it, he'd felt a mixture of disbelief and fascination. Now, every time he closed his eyes, he saw their curious eyes and that familiar stance, as if they had inherited not only his appearance, but also his way of observing the world. Michael wondered if the children shared anything else with him, his way of thinking, his tastes, his fears. Had they ever spoken of their absent father? Had they woven imaginary stories to explain his absence? In the afternoons following the encounter in the park, Michael contacted Martha. He sought her out with the nervousness of someone treading unknown ground, knowing that every answer she gave might dismantle the facade of his perfect existence. He found a modest apartment in a neighborhood he barely knew, one of those places he had always considered distant and irrelevant to his world. There lived Martha and the children, without luxury or comforts, without services he considered basic. Instead of large windows with privileged views, there were small, barred windows. Instead of hand-carved furniture, a few worn chairs. It was a humble home, but warm in its own way, etched with the constant effort of a mother who had fought adversity. Martha received him warily, without evident resentment, but with no trace of submission. Michael understood that she was not an opportunist. In her eyes, he saw the strength of someone who had done what needed to be done to get ahead on her own. He, on the other hand, felt out of place, trying to ask awkwardly, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you seek my help?" Martha sighed before answering. It was as though her words bore a weight that was hard to sustain. "I didn't tell you because back then, I didn't see in you even a hint of interest in starting a family. You were an ambitious young man, obsessed with success. You had an air of superiority that left no room to think of others, let alone raising children." She paused, looking him straight in the eye. "Also, you never bothered to stay in touch. To you, I was just another face in a catalogue of meaningless relationships. I stopped trying to reach you when I realized no good would come from forcing a connection with a man who didn't love me and likely wouldn't want any ties." Michael lowered his head, feeling each of those sentences strike straight into his conscience. He clearly remembered the stage in life Martha described, a time when people passed through his life without leaving a mark, disposable pieces in the chessboard of his ambitions. He, who prided himself on his business acumen, had never stopped to consider the human consequences of his everyday actions. How was it to raise them alone?" he asked, a lump in his throat. With a serenity born of years of hardship, Martha recounted the long journey she had traveled, the sleepless nights tending to 3 crying babies at once, the times she had to choose between paying the rent or buying clothes for them, illnesses without health insurance, frugal meals, Christmases without expensive gifts, but with the warmth of their mutual company. She spoke of her struggle to educate them, of how she worked low-paying jobs, of the solidarity of some neighbors, and the indifference of many others. Each word was a blow to Michael, who felt the bitterness of knowing that while she struggled, he enjoyed exquisite banquets and the comfort of a chauffeur at his service. As the conversation progressed, Michael became aware of a new emotion: fear. He was afraid of being an inadequate father. He, who had built a business empire, who had managed to manipulate the markets in his favor, knew nothing about parenthood. How was he expected to assume the role of guide, protector, and example for 3 children he hadn't even known existed until a few days ago? The idea terrified him. He feared ruining what little they had, feared disappointing them, feared that once again his characteristic selfishness would rise to the surface. His guilt continued to grow. Now that he knew of their existence, he couldn't pretend the children weren't part of his world. How could he ignore the scars that paternal absence had left on their lives? Merely offering money wasn't enough, he knew that well, since money had never been a substitute for sincere affection. What good was a check when what they had needed all those years was a father figure to say, "I'm here for you"? "I don't know what to do," Michael admitted quietly. Martha looked at him with a certain understanding. Despite the pain and the harshness of the circumstances, she was not cruel. She knew that this man, so powerful on the outside, was now disarmed before a responsibility he had never considered. "I'm not here to tell you what you have to do. Only you can decide that," she replied gently, but without hesitation. "I don't expect you to become the perfect father overnight. I just wanted you to know the truth. Now, the decision to get involved or not is yours." And so Michael was left with his dilemma pounding in his chest. Every sunset he watched from his office, he recalled Martha's words, the humility of her home, the children's gaze. He felt his perfect life wobble, the foundations of his identity cracking. On one side were his mansion, his luxury car, his tailored suits, and his art collections. On the other, the human, imperfect, raw reality that Martha had placed before his eyes. In the following days, he was tormented by the question, what kind of man did he want to be from now on? The answer was not simple. He felt trapped between guilt and uncertainty. He could take a step back, return to his old life, and pretend nothing had happened. But deep down, he knew he could no longer deceive himself. The laughter and looks of those children, Martha's resilience, the guilt crushing his chest, all shouted that his time living in a bubble had come to an end. Thus, plagued by his dilemma, Michael understood that his unexpected fatherhood was not only a family conflict, but also a moral crossroads that forced him to look into a mirror he had always avoided. Now he would have to face the consequences of his past life and decide whether or not he would change the course of his future. In the weeks following the discovery of his paternity, Michael was submerged in a sea of doubts and insecurities that only stirred him further inside. The image he had of himself, the successful man who controlled every aspect of his life, began to crack as he delved deeper into the past that had led him to this point. The relationship with Martha and the fact that for 12 years he had known nothing of his own children were pieces of a puzzle he had never before realized existed. At first, Martha had only given him a partial version of events. Her silence, her decision to raise the children alone, her conviction that he would never have responded positively to the news. However, when Michael began to ask more direct questions, he noticed a certain tension in Martha's gaze. Something remained unsaid. Over the course of several days, she finally admitted that long ago, when the children were very young, she had tried to contact him. She had sent a letter and some messages to an old address of his, attempting to inform him of the twins' existence. Martha acknowledged that she received no response, no rejection note, no visit, not even a terse message. Nothing. That void, that complete lack of response, had convinced her that he wanted nothing to do with it. In Martha's eyes, Michael's silence was an impenetrable wall. Yet when Michael heard this story, he couldn't recall ever seeing a letter or receiving any notice. It was possible that at that time he had been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder, on constantly moving to better residences, on multiple business trips, that the letter had been lost among thousands of documents, notifications, and proposals. Or perhaps someone in his service had discarded it as irrelevant. He would never know for sure, but the result had been the same. He did not respond, and his silence had been interpreted by Martha as absolute rejection. This revelation added another layer of guilt on his shoulders. Not only had he fathered 3 children without knowing it, but unwittingly, he had closed the door to an early approach. Lies and half-truths, lack of communication, and poor decisions in his youth had conspired to isolate him from his own family. A few weeks earlier, he would have denied such a thing was even possible, but now he understood. Immense fortunes and the power he wielded did not exempt him from being human, and as a human, he was vulnerable to errors with devastating consequences. Every time he thought about it, he felt guilt twisting his insides. He realized that Martha had faced life's hardships alone with 3 children in tow. She had resisted, stood her ground, done everything possible to raise them. Meanwhile, he had increased his wealth, accumulated possessions, multiplied his earnings, and strengthened his reputation. However, the more his financial empire grew, the greater the human void behind him. The pain of having abandoned Martha and the children struck him hard. He could no longer escape the harsh reality. It wasn't just about his newly discovered fatherhood, but about knowing he had been absent, a man who had not been there for those who needed him most. In retrospect, his perfect life now seemed like a gigantic mirage, built on oblivion, neglect, and lack of empathy. Money and power had been his refuges, his shields against vulnerability. But now, confronted with the evidence that 3 children had grown up without his support, those shields were useless. In the midst of these reflections, the children began to show small signs hinting at a slight interest in getting to know him. Michael noticed subtle details, a glance that was less evasive, a barely concealed curiosity, casual remarks that included him with some hesitation. These were not frank approaches or declarations of affection, but faint signals that, despite everything, they also wanted to know who this man claiming to be their father was. But insecurity paralyzed him. What could he offer them? How to establish a genuine bond after more than a decade of absence? Did he even have the right to try? The connection that began to form was fragile, threatened by all the past silences and resentments. Michael felt that any misstep could ruin the fragile relationship beginning to sprout. On the other hand, he himself was not sure of his capacity to be a father. Was it too late to remedy the abandonment? Could he offer them something more than financial support? He thought about his own childhood, about his father's coldness and his mother's absence, and realized he had no role model, no emotional tools to face this challenge. The idea of assuming fatherhood frightened him deeply. The moral dilemma was inevitable. He had to choose between remaining immersed in his life of luxury, ignoring the consequences of his past, or venturing into unknown territory where he would have to learn to love, understand, accompany, and be a real presence in his children's lives. His empires, his investments, and his achievements now seemed insignificant compared to the human magnitude of this decision. Days passed with suffocating slowness. Michael reviewed old contracts, searched his memory for the moment Martha might have tried to contact him. He tried to connect the dots, reconstructing the puzzle of lies, omissions, and errors that had led to this situation. But answers were elusive. Perhaps he himself had chosen not to see, not to listen, not to understand the signs. Perhaps his youthful arrogance, his craving for triumph, and his contempt for any distraction had created the perfect scenario for distance to become an abyss. Now, faced with the consequences of his past decisions, Michael understood that it was much more difficult to deal with moral responsibility than with financial problems. No advisor, lawyer, or accountant could solve the emotional chaos dominating him. He was alone with his conscience, forced to redefine his values. How to go on knowing that for so long he had ignored the existence of his own flesh and blood? While he agonized over these questions, the children remained there, around him, with their lives, their habits, their innocence damaged, but not destroyed. Martha had already done her part. She had revealed the truth. Now it was his turn to decide whether he would drown in remorse and fear, or dare to face the reality of being a father, with all that it implied. What had seemed like a simple challenge of assuming late fatherhood became, in Michael's mind, a profound emotional and moral conflict. He realized that at stake was not only his relationship with his children, but also the possibility of finding a new way of life, a meaning that transcended money and power. It was time to step into the unknown, to confront the consequences of his past, and to try, even if late, to approach his children with sincerity. Yet doubt consumed him. Would he truly be willing to change? The arrival of the children at Michael's mansion irrevocably altered the landscape of his life. Until just a few days ago, it had been a tidy, immaculate refuge where every object had its assigned place, schedules were flawlessly kept, and silence was the unbreakable norm. But now, with 3 children entering and exiting the rooms, their raised voices, their laughter, and their incessant curiosity, that almost monastic atmosphere was shattered. The first night they spent together was especially unsettling for Michael. Seated in a leather-upholstered armchair in the spacious main lounge, he contemplated the scene before his eyes with a mixture of astonishment and bewilderment. Toys were scattered over the carpet, brightly colored objects with strange shapes that the staff had hurriedly acquired to please the children, balls bouncing uncontrollably, and notebooks filled with childish drawings strewn over a table once used for formal dinners. At times, the children's conversation rose to a din that Michael found deafening. He found it hard to concentrate and noticed his heart beating faster than usual. Martha, meanwhile, moved through the house with a determined step, though her expression reflected tension. She was more accustomed to the children's presence, but not to this new dynamic in which she shared the same space with Michael and the three siblings. After years of struggle and hard work on her own, she found herself in a scenario where the greatest opulence clashed with the lingering resentment she carried inside. She knew the children needed a paternal figure, or at least deserved the chance to meet him. Yet she wondered if Michael would truly understand what that entailed. She watched him attempt to interact with the children awkwardly, unnaturally, with tense smiles that convinced no one. The children seemed to sense their father's discomfort and responded differently. One of them, the most withdrawn, simply ignored Michael, retreating to a corner with a book in hand. Another, more curious, stayed close, observing him with inquisitive eyes, as if studying a strange creature. The third, surprisingly, seemed to accept the man almost without reservations, laughing with him, showing him toys, and talking about trivial matters, though an attentive observer would have detected a slight shadow of sadness in his gaze. As for Michael, he felt overwhelmed. He had become a father overnight, without preparation, without a gradual process. It was as if he had been thrown onto a stage without a script, without prior rehearsal. He felt that every move he made was being closely analyzed by the children and Martha. If he got too close, the children withdrew. If he stayed away, they seemed to feel rejected. If he tried to joke, the forced laughter hung in the air, revealing his lack of naturalness. Guilt constantly gripped him. As he watched them play on the living room carpet, he remembered that they had grown up without his presence, without a father figure to rely on. How to make up for so many years of absence? How to connect with these little ones who carried his blood, but at the same time were complete strangers? Martha did not help him much either. Burdened by years of responsibilities, doubts, and pain, she could not give him the blind trust he might have hoped for. At times, she looked at him with a mixture of expectation and distrust. He could see the unspoken question on her face. Are you really going to stay? Or is this just a passing whim? Can we count on you? Or will you vanish as soon as you grow bored with us? Michael sensed in Martha the weight of the past, of his abandonment, and understood that words alone would not heal those wounds. He would have to prove, over time and through his actions, that he was there to stay. Each of the children responded differently to this new dynamic. The most distant one barely met Michael's gaze, lost in his own thoughts. The one who studied him from afar remained alert, trying to determine if this man was trustworthy. And the most open one, though he seemed to accept him easily at first, sometimes fell silent and stared off into the distance, as if recalling something painful. These mixed reactions generated constant tension. Michael did not know whom to approach first, nor how to interpret the children's emotions. His experiences with children had been limited to superficial encounters at charity events, where everyone wore smiles and posed for photos, but he had never dealt with the emotional complexity of kids who, moreover, carried the burden of his past neglect. Martha, in turn, was torn between her role as a protective mother and her desire to give Michael the chance to mend his mistakes. She knew the children needed a father, but feared that this man before her did not have the moral strength to stay and truly commit. There was effort in their interactions, unspoken reproaches, and a tension that pushed them toward conflict. Sometimes, the smallest thing, the way Michael addressed the children, or an unfortunate phrase from Martha, was enough to spark friction and unsettle the atmosphere. The once silent mansion now seemed like an emotional powder keg. As the hours passed, the chaos became more evident. Michael, accustomed to strict order, felt he had lost control. He could not predict the children's reactions or anticipate Martha's responses. He realized that neither money nor power could buy him his family's immediate understanding. Each unexpected laugh, each uncomfortable question about his past, each disappointed look in his children's eyes was a reminder that wanting to be a father wasn't enough. He would have to learn how and prove himself worthy. The tension became palpable, like an invisible thread, linking them all in a clumsy dance filled with doubts. The emotional chaos that had settled in the mansion was the result of the collision between Michael's perfectly structured world and the unpredictable reality of the family now trying to integrate into his life. For the first time, Michael understood that the challenge was not just to provide resources, but to open his heart, to be honest with himself and everyone else. That first night, with the children dozing half-heartedly in rooms that did not yet feel like their own, and Martha immersed in a silence laden with meaning, marked the beginning of a readjustment process. Far from simple, it would force him to face his fears, his guilt, and his unresolved past. In the following weeks, the tension between Michael, Martha, and the three children seemed to condense in every corner of the mansion. Although the children had settled in, each occupying their own room, hastily redecorated with items Michael thought they might like, the atmosphere remained dense. Despite his efforts to be kind and approachable, Michael felt increasingly rejected. His intention to please the children, to be the father he had never been, seemed to crash against a wall built from years of absence and hurt. The children, for their part, seemed to have found some routine inside the mansion. In the mornings, they gathered for breakfast in a spacious dining room overlooking the gardens. They maintained conversations among themselves, which Michael half listened to, trying to participate with a comment or two. Yet most of the time, his input was met with evasive replies, or worse still, uncomfortable silences. It wasn't that the children yelled at him or showed open contempt, rather their indifference, and at times those critical looks that didn't quite become reproaches but still ignited a spark of guilt in Michael's chest, was more painful than a direct confrontation. The most withdrawn child, who had barely spoken a few words since arriving, became an enigma to Michael. He seemed to live in his own world, absorbed in books, music, or any activity allowing him to pass the time without interacting with his newly discovered father. When Michael approached him, the boy merely looked up with a blank expression, as if gazing at a stranger. On certain occasions, when he thought no one noticed, Michael caught this son watching him with a mix of wounded curiosity and resentment, as if wanting to ask why it had taken so long for him to appear, or what right he now had to pretend they could be a family. The other two siblings displayed different but equally complex attitudes. One, the more curious one, still observed Michael from a distance, as though trying to decipher the authenticity of his intentions. He seemed torn between the hope of finally having a father figure and the fear of being disappointed again. Occasionally, he ventured to speak to Michael, asking simple questions about his routine, his work, or his past, but never delving too deep. It was as if the boy were testing Michael to see if his interest was genuine or just a temporary charade. The third child, who initially showed some openness, now began to withdraw. Michael noticed it in the way the boy avoided his gaze when he entered the room. Although he still occasionally smiled or showed mild friendliness, he no longer rushed to share stories or wholeheartedly enjoyed Michael's presence. It seemed that seeing his siblings' frustration, his own enthusiasm had faded. Without words, all three children drew invisible boundaries Michael didn't know how to cross. Caught in the middle of this scenario, Martha struggled with her own emotional crossroads. She had hoped for so long for some form of support, a partner to share the burdens of parenting. Yet now that Michael was present, her resentment toward him did not vanish. It was hard to forget the past, the sleepless nights, the financial distress, the emotional abandonment she had endured for years. On the other hand, if she wanted her children to have a chance at having a father, she needed to give Michael the benefit of the doubt. This inner tension made her distant and sometimes even irritable. In her conversations with Michael, her tone was terse and demanding. When he tried to learn more about the children's lives or routines, Martha responded with monosyllables or incomplete information. Michael interpreted this attitude as a form of punishment, a test he had to pass to prove his worth as a father and partner. At the same time, he felt disoriented and guilty, and so the mansion's walls bore witness to a silent drama of furtive glances, unspoken words, and uncomfortable silences. Michael began to seriously doubt whether he could give the children what they needed. He recalled his youth, when business success was his supreme goal, when people seemed like chess pieces he could move at will. Now, faced with the complexity of family life, he realized that his old paradigm no longer worked. He could not buy the children's trust or hire someone to earn their affection, nor could he expect them to accept him without first proving his commitment day after day. Family meals, afternoons in the garden, and evenings in the sitting rooms became small emotional battlegrounds. When Michael tried to approach one of the children, the child dodged his questions. When he tried to be strict, he feared sounding authoritarian and distant. When he tried tenderness, he worried the children would find him insincere. Every step seemed overly calculated, without the naturalness needed to form a genuine bond. Guilt consumed him. He was haunted by what could have been, by what he had missed during those 12 years. He could no longer soothe himself with thoughts of wealth, properties, and power. Now he understood, painfully, that material riches could not repair the emotional damage caused by his absence. At night, when the children slept, Michael wandered the mansion's halls, gazing at the closed doors of their rooms. Could he earn their respect and love? Or was he condemned to forever drag the consequences of his own negligence? The question that tormented him was as simple as it was devastating. Would it be enough? Could he become the father those children needed? Or would he repeat his past mistakes over and over again? Uncertainty wore him down. He felt paralyzed between the genuine desire to rebuild his life and the deep fear that he was incapable of doing so. For the first time, the notion of failure was no longer tied to financial losses or business defeats. Now, it took the shape of a family that could neither embrace nor accept him. Thus, amid these doubts, the tension continued to grow. Every look from the children, every resigned sigh from Martha, every corner of the mansion seemed to remind Michael that the rewards of fatherhood could not be obtained through business plans or million-dollar transactions. They required patience, authenticity, and a heart open to the possibility of change. Yet he was not sure he possessed those qualities. That uncertainty, that fear of not being enough, was the greatest challenge he had ever faced. Victor's arrival in Michael's life struck like lightning in a night already heavy with storm clouds. For weeks, Michael had been stumbling blindly between the guilt of his belated fatherhood and the uncertainty of whether he could be a good father. Now, the return of that old business partner, a man he had known in his youth and with whom he had shared dreams and plans, added a new layer of complication. Their reunion did not bring pleasant nostalgia, but rather a threat to everything Michael had built up to that point, especially the business empire he had raised through effort and sacrifice. Victor appeared without warning. One day, in the middle of a meeting with his lawyers, Michael received an urgent call. A man, armed with documents and evidence, claimed to have rights to part of the family legacy Michael had managed as he pleased for years. It was Victor. Their paths had parted long ago, marked by bitterness. The dissolution of their once promising partnership had left scars on both. But while Michael had climbed to new heights alone, Victor had followed another path, forging his own fortune far from his former partner's shadow. The news hit Michael like a hammer. Just as he was trying to learn how to be a father to 3 children who barely accepted him, as he struggled with Martha's constant gaze and the resentment and tension within his mansion's walls, he now had to face a legal and emotional battle with Victor. This was not a simple business dispute. It was a confrontation with his own past. Victor knew very well where to strike to hurt him, knew his weaknesses and resentments. The question was whether Michael was ready to withstand that blow, now that his inner world was already in turmoil. Their first meeting took place in a private restaurant, away from reporters and onlookers. Michael, accustomed to dominating negotiations, found himself strangely insecure. Victor entered with a confident stride, wearing an impeccable suit and a crooked smile. His eyes showed a rancor time had not dulled. He sat down in front of Michael and, without beating around the bush, laid out his position. He wanted to regain control of certain assets they once shared, a fraction of the family businesses Michael had consolidated into his own empire. Victor claimed to have documents, unfulfilled agreements, and broken promises that supported his demands. What was most unsettling was his constant insinuation that if Michael didn't yield, he could be exposed before the world. And worse yet, he could lose the fragile stability he had just begun to build in his personal life. "You've been very busy lately, Michael," Victor said with a calmness that chilled the blood. "I've heard about your new family situation. 3 children, right? And Martha, how is she doing? I imagine it must be difficult to deal with such personal matters when you have so many fronts open in your business dealings." The mention of Martha and the children could not have been accidental. Michael immediately sensed the trap. Victor had done his homework, tracking Michael's recent moves and any hushed rumors of a disputed custody, and now intended to use that information as a weapon. Michael realized he was not just fighting over property or the reins of a company, but also his emotional stability and the new relationship with his children. With each new meeting, the pressure increased. Victor, skilled at manipulating situations, always showed up with additional evidence and new arguments that cornered Michael. At the same time, the stress began to affect life in the mansion. Nervous and absent, Michael spent more hours locked in his study, talking on the phone with lawyers, reviewing old documents, searching for legal loopholes to invalidate Victor's claims. Meanwhile, the children, each in their own way, sensed a change in their father. They saw him more distant, more tormented by something they couldn't fully understand. Martha, for her part, realized that Michael's inner battle was intensifying. She watched him with a furrowed brow, and although she wasn't used to intervening in his business affairs, she knew something serious was happening. As the situation grew more complicated, Victor dropped veiled threats. He spoke of how Michael's personal life stability could be compromised, how the law and the courts might favor whoever best managed the information. He didn't need to be explicit. It was enough to insinuate that if Michael didn't yield to his financial demands, something more precious than money might be at risk. Perhaps he meant Michael's reputation, or the custody of the children, or some legal clause that could put him in a difficult position. Whatever it was clear that Victor took pleasure in seeing his former partner squirm between duty and fear. More than once, sitting in his dimly lit office, Michael recalled the time when he and Victor were almost like brothers, ambitious youths with grand visions. Those days had vanished the moment Michael's priorities had shifted solely to his career, leaving behind people who once mattered. Was Victor's return a kind of revenge from fate? Now that Michael was trying to reconnect with his humanity, with his paternal role and emotional responsibility, he also had to face the business sins of his youth. Victor's presence was a catalyst for tension, reminding Michael that his carefully constructed world of success was not invincible. The documents Victor presented, the old alliances, the unfulfilled commitments, stood as a testament that the past could not be hidden behind wealth and power. It was a painful reminder. Michael's personal history, his lack of empathy, the rupture with partners and friends, and his distance from his family were all part of the same inseparable whole. Now, needing to prove to the children that he could be a real father, with Martha's distrust lingering, and with the threat of losing part of his empire, Michael felt like a pawn in Victor's game. If he didn't handle things carefully, he could lose everything: the chance to earn his children's love, the fragile relationship he was trying to forge with Martha, and the financial solidity he had valued so much in the past. Victor's resentment was a key that opened doors to even greater chaos, and Michael understood that the only way out might be to finally confront the ghosts of his past he had preferred to ignore. In the weeks following Victor's return, the tension in Michael's life increased exponentially. The children, still struggling to adapt to their father's presence, perceived a strange atmosphere in the mansion: urgent calls, secret meetings, silences loaded with meaning. Martha watched warily, guessing that a new enemy lurked outside the fragile order that had just begun to form. Meanwhile, Michael wrestled with his own fears and anger at being cornered by his former partner's demands. It was on a cloudy afternoon, in a discreetly rented meeting room, that Victor presented his offer. The place lacked the luxury that characterized Michael's spaces. Instead, the grey walls and stark lighting seemed designed to emphasize the deal's harshness. Victor spoke straightforwardly, without beating around the bush, a calculated smile on his face. His words flowed with the smoothness of a sharp knife gliding over skin. He asked Michael for something more than money. He wanted Michael to yield part of his empire in exchange for the legal, peaceful custody of the children. The proposal was as disconcerting as it was offensive. Michael, used to measuring his life in terms of acquisitions and conquests, now faced the paradox of having to buy his role as a father, in a sense. Victor laid it out coldly and rationally. In exchange for certain shares in the family businesses and a significant portion of his fortune, he would neutralize any legal action that might complicate custody. He promised that with his influence, paternity disputes could be resolved in Michael's favor, without further obstacles. This offer turned his relationship with his children into a commercial transaction, something that made Michael's stomach churn. As he listened to Victor, Michael felt anger rising in his throat. He knew that his ex-partner's words targeted not only his business, but also his heart. The message was clear. If Michael did not yield, Victor was willing to endanger everything he had achieved. The man who had walked beside him in youth, sharing dreams and ambitions, now showed him his vilest side, reminding him that unresolved past issues came with a heavy price. Later, back at his mansion, Michael locked himself in his study. He left his phone on the desk and sank into his armchair. From there, he could see the garden, where his children chased after a ball. At that moment, they seemed oblivious to the tensions poisoning the air. It was a tempting, almost idyllic image. Children in the prime of childhood, carefree, enjoying the moment. Yet Michael couldn't stop thinking that this normality was fragile. If he did not act carefully, custody would become a puppet Victor could manipulate at will. The dilemma was complex. Accepting Victor's proposal meant a blow to his pride, a humiliating concession to a man who had always seen him as a rival. It meant giving up part of what he had built through effort, sweat, and sacrifice. Michael hated the idea of losing control of his businesses, of yielding some of his power to someone so unscrupulous. But the alternative, getting entangled in endless legal battles, risking his children's well-being, watching the newborn stability shatter into 1,000 pieces, terrified him even more. Martha, who had no knowledge of the details, sensed Michael's nervousness. Once, she dared to ask what was happening. Avoiding her gaze, he answered evasively. He did not want to admit that the fatherhood he was trying to reclaim might become caught in the nets of a corporate blackmail. However, Martha was not naive. She knew Michael too well and realized something big was happening behind the scenes. That night, struggling to sleep, Michael remembered his youth and the moment he broke ties with Victor. They had drifted apart because their business visions differed, and Michael had decided to move forward without looking back. Now the past returned with a thirst for revenge. Isn't this some form of karma? He thought bitterly. Am I not paying now for having abandoned relationships, people, and emotional commitments? Victor's offer came just as Michael tried to be a different man, one capable of putting the children's well-being before his own ambition. It was cruel and symbolic. The opportunity to truly be a father meant giving up part of what he had considered essential for so many years. If he wanted to keep his children under his roof, shielded from endless legal disputes and blackmail, he had to surrender a piece of his kingdom to a man who despised him. This enraged him. He felt the injustice of the situation burning inside. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the humiliation of being manipulated. At the same time, desperation ate away at him. What if he didn't agree? Would he risk losing his children, watching them depart amid a legal scandal he could not contain? The moral dilemma crushed him. The choice between power and family love, between hoarding wealth and emotional integrity, presented itself with terrifying starkness. His economic empire, once his shield against vulnerability, now trapped him in a cage. And Victor held the key, waiting for Michael to yield. For the first time, he understood that being a father wasn't something money could solve. Hiring more competent lawyers or offering the children costly toys was not enough. This time, he needed to show courage, sacrifice, and principles. But what principles did a man who had lived solely for success still have? The fear that he would fail weighed him down. Staring into the darkness, Michael clenched his fists. He knew that sooner or later, he would have to give Victor an answer. Meanwhile, doubt gnawed at his spirit. If he surrendered part of his fortune, could he face himself in the mirror without despising himself for giving what he most valued to his worst enemy? And if he didn't do it, could he withstand the pressure, fight for custody, and avoid failing again those who now depended on him? The night passed without respite. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight lit up Michael's tired face. He remained motionless in his armchair, still undecided but aware that time was running out. He understood that beyond Victor's blackmail, this was the ultimate test of what kind of man he was willing to become. If he yielded, perhaps he could ensure a more stable legal environment for his children. If he resisted, he might keep his pride, but risk losing the children. Was there a dignified escape from this maze? That question would torment him from that day forward, giving him no respite as the clock ticked on mercilessly. In the days following Victor's offer, Michael's life became a kaleidoscope of emotions and doubts. From dawn to dusk, his mind wrestled with a whirlwind of fear, anger, guilt, and indecision. The man who had built an empire with his own hands, who prided himself on his rationality and ability to make tough decisions without blinking, now could not find the clarity he desperately needed. For the first time in his life, his ambition and pride felt more like a burden than a strength. His days passed in a tense semblance of normalcy. In front of the children, Michael tried to maintain a serene facade, without too many gestures betraying the intense internal struggle consuming him. The kids were still grappling with their own conflicts, a mixture of curiosity, distrust, and resentment toward the father they had never known. Martha, more distant than ever, limited herself to watching him with a mixture of reproach and skepticism, as if sensing another storm about to break. The mansion, once an inviolable refuge of his success, had turned into a distorted mirror in which Michael saw a reflection he did not recognize. He walked through the halls with his hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the marble floors and the artworks on the walls. He used to admire that environment with pride, as tangible proof of how far he had come. But now those luxuries seemed empty, incapable of filling the emotional abyss opening before him. He would stop at the windows, watching the gardens where his children played, wondering if the world he had built held any real value without the love and respect of his family. At night, insomnia attacked him. Hours passed while he lay in bed, analyzing every possibility. If he gave in to Victor's demands, he could ensure custody without legal complications. He would spare the children a conflict that would hurt them even more. Wasn't that what a responsible father would do? But at the same time, that option meant relinquishing part of his empire, admitting that his material achievements were not unbreakable and that his old partner had the power to snatch away a piece of what he had defended so fiercely. On the other hand, resisting Victor's demands would be a statement of principles, proof that he would not be intimidated, that he could protect his legacy without yielding to blackmail. But at what cost? The legal battle could be long, costly, and scandalous, directly affecting the children who had already suffered enough. Could he put his pride before their well-being? Could he bear the guilt of seeing them drawn into a dispute that would rob them of the fragile peace they were beginning to build? The tension of this dilemma began to filter into his relationship with the children. Although he tried to remain close, his smiles were more forced, his gaze more troubled. The children didn't fully understand what was happening, but they felt the unease in the air, the anxiety hiding behind every carefully chosen word and cautious gesture. Instead of bringing them closer, the situation seemed to erect new, invisible barriers between them. One afternoon in the garden, one of the children dared to ask, "Are you okay, Dad? You seem worried." Michael swallowed hard. How could he explain to a child that his father, a powerful grown man, was paralyzed by fear of making a decision that could change everything? He simply said, "I'm fine. I just have a lot on my mind. Don't worry." But that answer did not reassure him. On the contrary, it emphasized the emptiness he felt. Michael understood that he could no longer avoid reality. He had to choose a direction. The crossroads was clear. He could cling to his old self, who viewed life through victories and material conquests, or he could risk whatever was necessary for the children's emotional well-being, for the chance to become a real father, not just a distant provider. Every time he thought about it, his heart tightened. He reproached himself for reaching this point without the emotional tools he needed. He had spent too many years focused on professional goals, never cultivating empathy, humility, or the ability to connect with others. Now that life demanded something different, he felt like a clumsy apprentice, afraid of making irreparable mistakes. The inner conflict reached its peak one night when Michael was alone in his study, accompanied only by the city lights and the faint sound of the wind at the windows. There, with a glass of whiskey in hand, he looked at his reflection in the glass pane. What he saw was not the successful magnate, but a tired man, full of doubts, his face marked by the weight of indecision. He understood that even though he possessed wealth and power, he lacked the self-confidence required to be the father his children needed. That realization hurt more than any business defeat. Time was pressing, and with each passing day, the pressure intensified. Michael knew he could not avoid the ultimate question. Should he protect his empire, clinging to his identity as a cold, calculating businessman, or challenge his own notion of success and sacrifice, part of his wealth for the chance to truly become a father? The answer was not simple, and insecurity gnawed at him. In that moment of introspection, Michael realized that no matter what decision he made, nothing would be the same. If he ceded part of his fortune, his empire would be tainted by the defeat before Victor, and he might never regain the unshakable status he once enjoyed. But in exchange, he could give his children the stability they deserved, showing them they were above any material interest. If he resisted, he would protect his business achievements, but at what emotional cost? The tension kept rising. Michael felt guilt, fear, and ambition fighting for control of his soul. He was unsure how it would all end. He only knew he had to decide soon. Life would not give him more time. The children needed him now, not at some indefinite future point. And so, on the brink of the abyss of his certainties, Michael readied himself to make the most momentous choice of his life, one that would define not only the course of his companies, but also the deeper meaning of his existence. Immersed in the whirlwind of tensions around him, Michael felt compelled to dig into the past, hoping to find some clarity amidst so much darkness. Negotiations with Victor, the pressures of custody, and the sudden role he had to assume as a father made him doubt everything he had once believed secure. It was as if he were in a labyrinth whose walls grew taller with every step. In this desperation, he decided he had to examine the family archives more closely. There, at the heart of his lineage's history, he hoped to find some answer that would help him understand how he had ended up in this disaster. The archives were in a small study at the back of the mansion. The room was paneled in dark wood, and the air had a musty aroma from decades of stored documents. Michael had avoided this place for years. Every time he set foot inside, he felt the weight of his father's expectations and decisions. But now he had no choice. He turned on the old desk lamp and began sifting through folders and boxes that seemed untouched for a very long time. Hours went by as he encountered technical documents, old contracts, accounting balances, correspondence with former partners. Most were outdated, from a time when his father was still alive and the family managed more traditional businesses. However, As he delved deeper into this paper labyrinth, he began to find records that unsettled him. Risky business decisions, dubious investments, financial maneuvers bordering on illegality. His father, that distant, cold man who never gave him a model of affection, had left behind a legacy full of ambiguities and possible deceit. Among the boxes, Michael discovered an old notebook with a worn cover, containing his father's personal notes. The neat, rigid handwriting described plans that never materialized, partnerships that were formed and died quietly. There he saw Martha's name mentioned repeatedly, along with that of her family. According to these notes, there had been a project, some sort of deal involving economic resources from Martha's family. Something had gone wrong. The documents spoke of disagreements, impulsive business decisions that ruined some of those involved. Michael's breathing quickened when, digging even deeper, he found a bundle of letters hidden in a drawer behind a shelf. They were letters between his father and Martha. Martha's handwriting, firm yet full of tension, described the failed attempts to finalize a business deal that the family had never openly discussed. The letters indicated that Martha's family had put resources on the table, promised a solid partnership, but something, perhaps Michael's father's arrogance or a treacherous move by Victor, had sunk the agreement. The last letters from Martha dripped with disappointment and, above all, a palpable pain hinting at consequences beyond the financial realm. As Michael read, an idea began to form in his mind. His family not only played a passive role in Martha and the children's disappearance from his life, but may have been a determining factor. What if his father's wrong strategies and greed contributed to the economic crisis Martha's family faced? What if that silent departure, that life in which Martha had to raise the children alone, was forced by the poor decisions of Michael's family? The discovery stunned him. Until now, he had thought his paternal absence was the result of his own negligence and poor communication. But what if behind it all lay a more complex web, a toxic inheritance running through his family's business veins? If that were the case, then Victor, who once was a close associate of his father, must have known. Perhaps his return wasn't mere coincidence. Maybe he intended to unearth secrets and settle old scores not only with Michael, but with the entire family. The blackmail over custody might just be the tip of an iceberg of a revenge long in the making. Memories of Michael's childhood took on a new shade. That emotionally absent father, always immersed in business meetings and shady deals, never showed him the empire's true face. During his youth, Michael assumed his father was simply a cold, hard-working man. But now he understood that behind that facade could have existed a network of lies. If his father's decisions had ruined Martha's family, causing her to leave with the children, then the guilt Michael felt over his own absence was now magnified by a backdrop of injustice and manipulation. To make matters worse, Victor was not just a commercial rival. He had shared secrets with his father, had been part of that structure Michael was now uncovering. Facing him again in these circumstances meant waging a war not only with legal maneuvers or business deals, but also with the privileged information each possessed. Victor may have known everything from the start, waiting for the right moment to use it. With the bundle of letters still in his hand, Michael collapsed into a chair, overwhelmed. The battle for the children's custody was no longer merely personal, about pride or paternity. It had become a confrontation with deep roots. Now he realized that to have any chance of healing the present wounds, he must unearth the truths of the past. Michael's mind raced. How to present this information to Martha? She deserved to know that her family had been harmed not just by his absence, but by a trail of bad decisions from a previous generation. How would he explain to the children, someday, that their father had not only been negligent, but also an involuntary part of a chain of dark events affecting their mother? And above all, how would he face Victor, now that he suspected Victor might hold documents, secret agreements, and evidence of his family's guilt? Questions piled up incessantly. Michael could barely believe the sea of lies he had grown up in. Each new truth was like a knife plunging into the idealized image he once held of himself and his family. He understood that the struggle for custody was not just a legal matter. It was a metaphor for his need to redeem himself, to cleanse his family name, to show that unlike his father, he was willing to risk everything for truth and his children's well-being. The weight of these revelations oppressed him. Leaving that dark study, clutching the letters with trembling hands, hurt him. With every step toward the hallway's light, he felt the past clinging to his ankles like invisible chains. Yet despite fear and confusion, he knew he could no longer ignore what he had found. The lie about what really happened with Martha and the children ran much deeper than he had imagined. Now, with the veil lifted, Michael found himself in the midst of a war threatening to demolish his empire, his reputation, and above all, the fragile chance to be the father his children needed. On the afternoon Michael and Victor came face to face in Michael's office, the atmosphere in the skyscraper felt almost ceremonial. It was as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. That office, which had always been Michael's unassailable territory, his fortress of power and accomplishments, now looked like a stage for confrontation, where masks would fall and hidden truths would come to light. The tension was palpable, like a taut rope between two men unwilling to yield a single millimeter. Victor arrived with his usual arrogance. He brought a folder of documents and a sardonic smile. His confident stride and the way he settled into the chair across from Michael's desk showed he was determined to assert himself. Michael watched him in silence for a moment, remembering when they had shared ambitions and dreams before greed and distrust tore them apart. Now that past was a minefield, each memory could explode at any moment. "Why all the ceremony?" Victor asked with feigned innocence. "We could have solved this more amicably, Michael." Michael did not fall into the provocation. He remained standing, hands on the desk. For weeks he'd been at the mercy of Victor's subtle maneuvers and veiled blackmail, but today he had decided he would not be manipulated anymore. This was no longer just about money or business shares, not even about legal pressures on the children's custody. It was about his dignity, his values, and the life he wanted for his family. "You've been playing with my circumstances for a long time," Michael said, not raising his voice, but with the firmness of someone who will not retreat. "You thought that by attacking my family, pressuring me with past secrets, and exploiting my weaknesses, you could break me. You are mistaken." Victor arched an eyebrow. Clearly, he had not expected such resolve from Michael. He had assumed that emotional chaos and veiled threats would keep him trapped. Yet the determination he now saw in Michael's eyes made him frown. "Let's see then," Victor replied, dripping cynicism. "You know perfectly well I haven't played all my cards. I have evidence, documents about your father's old maneuvers, those involving Martha and her family. Do you think your children will look kindly on the kind of past that weighs on your family name?" Mentioning the children ignited a spark of fury inside Michael. Until then, he had controlled his temper, but now he felt Victor cross a line he would not tolerate. Those children, his family, were his true strength. He would not let the past tarnish what he was trying to rebuild. "I don't care about your money or your power," Michael said, stepping forward. "I won't let you sully my family with your intrigues. Perhaps my father made mistakes, but I am not him, and I won't make the same ones. If you want to bring me down with secrets, go ahead. I won't run from the truth anymore. I prefer to face it." Victor clenched his jaw. For a moment he looked surprised. Michael, who had always used financial power and influence to maintain his position, was now speaking a different language, that of integrity and moral courage. This wasn't in Victor's script. "Do you really think that with nobility and pretty words you'll solve this?" Victor snapped disdainfully. "In the real world, Michael, money rules. People follow the scent of fortune. And you, who have perched yourself on the throne of your empire, should know this better than anyone." Michael shook his head. He knew Victor was right about one thing. For years, he himself had believed in that creed. Money ruled. But now his experience had led him to see the other side of the coin. Nothing he had accumulated could buy his children's respect, Martha's trust, or the inner peace he so desperately needed. "You can think whatever you want, but I won't dance to your tune anymore," Michael replied. "If you want to fight in court, we'll fight. If you want to air the dirty laundry of the past, go right ahead. But don't be mistaken. I will do whatever is necessary to protect my family from your poison. I won't run or give in any further. Let it be clear, I'm not afraid of you, Victor." Michael's words marked a turning point. Victor, who had imagined a brittle man, now faced someone willing to sacrifice part of his empire to do the right thing. Victor's face twisted into an angry grimace as he realized the game had changed. "As you wish," he said tensely, jumping up from his seat. "Just don't say I didn't warn you." Without another word, Victor left, leaving behind a heavy silence. Michael remained there in his office, feeling that something inside him had broken and rebuilt itself at the same time. This confrontation wasn't the end of the battle, but the beginning of a deeper war, one that would no longer be waged solely in the realm of money, but also on the grounds of honesty and honor. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, the children were beginning to sense the tension in the air. Although they didn't understand the details, they felt that their father and the adult world around them were engulfed in an uncertain struggle. Martha also perceived the gravity of the moment and feared the repercussions. The confrontation between Michael and Victor reverberated beyond the walls of the office, affecting every member of the family, shaking the roots of a story full of silences and half-truths. Tired and with the bitter taste of confrontation lingering, Michael left the office and gazed at the city through the window. For a long time, he had believed that control, wealth, and influence were enough to rule his life. Now he understood that the greatest power lay in the determination not to let greed dictate everything. For the first time in a long while, he felt he was moving toward a more honest version of himself. But he also knew that the road ahead would be long, complex, and full of dangers. Without a doubt, this showdown with Victor had marked a point of no return. It remained to be seen how fate would respond to Michael's decision not to surrender, to fight for his family, armed with courage and sincerity. The war was far from over, and everyone involved sensed it. With his heart still pounding, Michael braced himself for what lay ahead, knowing that, come what may, he would never be the same man he had been before that day. As the weeks passed, Michael's world seemed divided into two equally exhausting battlefields. On one side, the legal sphere, where he had to face a system that Victor manipulated skillfully with his resources and influences. On the other, the intimate family realm, where silences, unspoken reproaches, and shared guilt permeated every conversation, every look, every gesture. The mansion, once a symbol of his achievements, had now become a space in permanent tension, uncertain ground where hope for a better future coexisted with fears of a past that weighed on everyone. The custody trial advanced mercilessly. Even though Michael had competent lawyers, he lacked the experience and network of contacts that Victor wielded with undeniable cunning. Every day brought reports of new legal maneuvers, unexpected witnesses, and leaked information to the press that fueled doubts about Michael's fitness as a father. Victor played his cards with exasperating calm, as if savoring Michael's entanglement in a web of technicalities and accusations where truth was a blurred concept. However, what unsettled Michael most did not happen in the courtroom, but in the privacy of his home. There, the children, who until recently had kept their distance, began to show small signs of approaching him. In the mornings at the breakfast table, one of them dared to ask something simple, like what his favorite dish was, or what he did as a child. The tone was still cautious, but no longer completely disdainful. Another child watched him, sometimes curiously, sometimes distrustfully, but his looks were less cold than before. Even the most withdrawn one, who seemed unwilling to forgive his past absence, had stopped evading him so vehemently, now only offering short responses or ambiguous gestures that, at least, were not openly hostile. Though subtle, these changes were a balm for Michael. They suggested that perhaps the children wanted to give him a chance, that they were willing to know him beyond the distant, powerful figure they had imagined for years. But his willingness was not enough. The gulf of the past remained, immense and painful. Michael knew he couldn't erase the years of absence, the nights they had wondered why they had no present father, the resentment that had taken root with every birthday without him, every difficult moment Martha had faced alone. Still, Michael felt compelled to try. He understood that he couldn't buy their affection with expensive gifts or empty promises. Now he sensed that fatherhood was not a transaction, but a bond woven with patience, dedication, and honesty. Sometimes he would sit with them, proposing a simple activity, like doing a puzzle or watching a movie together, without pressure, without forcing closeness. At first, they were uncomfortable and reluctant, but sometimes one would stay a few minutes longer before making an excuse to leave, or would ask him a question about the plot, as if yearning for an excuse to keep interacting. Martha, in turn, observed this dynamic with understandable skepticism. For years, she had borne the responsibility of protecting the children, providing a stable environment despite adversity. Now she watched Michael try to become involved, to show a human and committed side, but she knew too well the fragility of intentions. She feared it might end in disappointment once again. However, from time to time, through imperceptible gestures, a less hard look, a sigh accompanied by a slight nod, Martha seemed to acknowledge Michael's effort, even if she said nothing. The emotional strain was enormous. Michael spent sleepless nights analyzing strategies with his lawyers, trying to anticipate Victor's moves. When exhaustion overcame him and he slept a few hours, he woke up with the same knot in his chest, the fear of failure, of losing custody, of being unable to maintain that fragile connection just beginning to sprout with the children. The sensationalist press, rumors in the business world, insinuations that he was nothing more than a businessman incapable of managing a family. All of it swirled in his mind, eroding his confidence. Despite everything, he had made an unwavering decision. His family was his priority. In the past, he would have sacrificed any relationship, any emotional bond for his career. Now, however, he was willing to sacrifice part of his fortune, his comfort, and even his reputation to ensure the children could grow up without the shadow of blackmail and manipulation. He was aware of the high emotional cost, but he no longer wanted to live in a world where power was everything and affection had no place. The internal pressure mixed with the external pressure. Each day he felt as if walking on a tightrope. On one side, the temptation to revert to his old self, to protect his business empire at any cost, to use the brute force of money to crush Victor. On the other, the promise of a more authentic future, with fewer masks and more genuine bonds, although without guarantees of success. The balance was precarious, and Michael felt any misstep could make him fall. However, with every kind gesture from the children, with every look from Martha that showed a hint of respect, Michael realized it was worth trying. This was no longer just about winning a legal battle, but about achieving something much more difficult: the right to be a worthy father, the possibility of growing as a human being and building a united family, despite a turbulent past. Every day of struggle was an emotional endurance test, a lesson in humility. The internal tension that consumed him wouldn't disappear overnight. The battle against Victor, the weight of family secrets, and the wounds that would take time to heal were all still there. But Michael pressed on, step by step, trying not to lose sight of what truly mattered: the children, his family, the opportunity to be better than he had been. If until then he had considered himself a successful man, now he understood that true success would be measured in terms of love, trust, and the future of those who depended on him. And so, amid endless trials, afternoons of tension and nervous looks, Michael carried on, determined not to give up. The path was uncertain and painful, but with each passing day, he became more convinced that if he could hold on to his convictions and withstand the coming storms, perhaps in the end he would find a peace he had never known. On the morning Michael found himself signing the delegation of certain executive responsibilities of his businesses, he experienced a bitter feeling he never imagined he would feel. For years, he had ruled his empire with a firm hand, making crucial decisions for business expansion, monitoring every detail, and ensuring maximum efficiency. Now, after fighting for custody and confronting Victor, he found himself uncomfortably needing to step back from the center of command. In the past, that office overlooking the city had been his kingdom. Today, it was a space he had to learn to abandon, at least partially, to focus on something far more important. This sacrifice was not easy. Giving up absolute control of his companies meant overcoming his pride and ambition, those internal forces that had driven him throughout his adult life. However, he understood that continuing to cling to his old role would not allow him to devote the time and energy the children needed. As lawyers refined the agreements and signatures filled the documents, Michael realized that each stroke of the pen was a step toward an uncertain but more authentic future. The first tangible consequence of this transition was feeling the weight of the time he used to invest in business, now freed up for things he once considered trivial. Ordinary activities, like being present at the children's lunchtime, taking them to school, or sitting down to talk with them, became tasks of incalculable value. At first, this closeness was uncomfortable. The children were still used to an absent father, and the constant interaction awakened distrust, tense silences, or brusque comments. But Michael did not give up. He understood that rebuilding trust would not happen overnight. As days passed, Michael discovered that his world did not crumble because he delegated responsibilities. Although his business empire might face the risk of lacking his constant direction, his teams and partners proved more capable of making decisions than he had expected. By delegating tasks to competent people, he found he was not indispensable for every detail. This realization, far from wounding his ego, brought relief and perspective. With each small delegation, he freed himself from unnecessary burdens and could invest more time in his family, in understanding the children's fears, in listening to them, and above all, in giving them the presence they had sorely lacked. The legal battle continued, with back and forths, pressures, and rumors. Victor kept throwing his darts, trying to undermine Michael's reputation. But now, the difference was that Michael had a clarity of purpose he hadn't possessed before. He had stopped focusing solely on winning at all costs, on keeping his empire intact, and instead concentrated on what truly mattered, providing the children with a safe, stable environment and showing them that, despite his mistakes, he was willing to change and learn how to be a father. This transformation did not occur without pain. There were nights when Michael felt on the brink of despair, wondering if he was doing the right thing. Sometimes he was overwhelmed by the fear that his partial withdrawal from the business world would be in vain, that the children would never truly love him, that his sacrifice would go unappreciated. But deep down, he knew that fatherhood was not a business contract or a transaction, but rather a profoundly human commitment, full of emotional risks. Little by little, the family dynamic began to show encouraging signs. One of the children, the most curious one, started asking questions about his past, his personal tastes, and Michael answered sincerely, without the arrogance that once defined him. The boy was surprised to see that his father, that distant tycoon, also had fears, childhood anecdotes, passions beyond business. The most withdrawn child, although he continued to keep his distance, occasionally let slip a shy smile at one of Michael's genuine comments, as if admitting there might be something more than coldness in that man. The third child, who had shown some openness from the start, now dared to share small everyday joys, no longer afraid that his father would dismiss them. Martha witnessed these changes with skepticism, but also with cautious hope. She, who had sustained the household for years without support, noticed Michael's absences from the office and his more frequent presence in the mansion. She saw that he now helped the children with their homework, tried to understand their problems, and showed more humility. Although it was hard for her to forget the past, Michael's attitude indicated that something fundamental was changing. Perhaps he was no longer the same man who left her alone, who prioritized his career over his family responsibilities. Maybe, after so much conflict, he had learned the most valuable lesson of his life. And that lesson was precisely what Michael was beginning to internalize. His life was not measured solely by his fortune or his market position. It served no purpose to have absolute control of his business if he lost his family in the process. As the weeks passed, Michael understood that true value lay in being a good father, in being there to guide, listen, share quality time, and teach his children what truly mattered: love, loyalty, responsibility, respect for others. Realizing these new priorities did not automatically solve all the problems. The legal battle with Victor continued. Emotional wounds did not heal overnight, and the children needed time to believe in Michael's sincerity. But he had embarked on a path he no longer wished to abandon. Each sacrifice in the business arena was one less brick in the wall that had separated him from his family. Each step back in his professional life was a step forward in his relationship with his children. The awareness that his life was not defined by the size of his bank account or his business achievements grew daily in Michael. Now he felt committed not to figures and profit reports, but to the well-being of those 3 children who, little by little, were starting to see him not as a powerful stranger, but as a father willing to change. With every act of humility and dedication, Michael laid the foundation for a new life, one in which his family occupied the place it should never have lost. The morning of the final hearing arrived with tense weather and grey skies, as if nature itself reflected the uncertainty looming over the children's fate. Michael walked toward the courthouse with his heart beating rapidly and his palms slightly sweaty. Despite his efforts, he had not slept well the previous night. In the darkness of his room, he had gone over the legal arguments, his lawyer's statements, the evidence submitted, the witnesses and the strategies Victor had used to cloud the process. Now, with the children waiting at home, guided by Martha and a handful of loyal employees, Michael stood alone before the imminent verdict. The courtroom, a wide hall with wooden walls and tall windows, was packed. Discreet journalists took notes in a corner, curious onlookers sought seats in the back row, and both legal teams remained tense, reviewing documents until the last second. The atmosphere was so dense it could almost be touched, filled with whispers, furtive glances, and the distant echo of past decisions that had led to this moment. Victor was there, at the other end. He wore a dark, elegant suit and held his chin high, feigning a calm Michael knew was fake. In previous weeks, it had been a battlefield of lawyers, witnesses, and evidence jumping from one side to the other. Victor had tried everything, revealing family secrets, exposing Michael's past faults, questioning his ability to be a good father. But time had not passed in vain. Shaped by circumstances, Michael had shown the judge that his priority now was the children, not power, not fortune, not revenge. The judge entered with solemnity. A sepulchral silence fell over the room. The anticipation was total. Michael felt a lump in his throat, aware that the ruling would set the course of his and the children's lives. While the judge settled, reviewing papers and noting the tension around him, Michael remembered his lawyer's words from the night before. "You have shown commitment. You have given up part of your empire. You have become involved in your children's lives. None of that goes unnoticed." Still, in matters of justice, nothing was guaranteed. The deliberations had been long and complex. The case was not limited to a custody dispute. It involved a family background riddled with secrets, questionable past decisions, and the interference of a man like Victor, who had tried to manipulate the system in his favor. When the judge began to speak, his firm, clear voice rose above the invisible tensions. He impartially reviewed the facts. Michael's prolonged absence in the children's lives, his recent effort to reconnect with them, evidence that Victor had used underhanded tactics to tip the scales, and the need to protect the children from harmful environments. Minutes felt like hours. Michael barely breathed, trying to read between the lines of the judge's tone and expressions. Finally, the key words emerged from the sentence. Custody was granted to Michael. The judge considered that, despite past mistakes, the father's current commitment to the children was genuine, and that Victor's maneuvers posed a risk to their well-being. The magistrate acknowledged the children's right to grow up in a more stable environment, giving Michael the opportunity to prove with actions that he could be the father they needed. When the judge's final words echoed through the hall, Michael closed his eyes for a moment and felt a chill run down his spine. He had won. But the victory did not feel like a joyous triumph, rather an immense responsibility. He knew he had paid a very high price, financial losses, giving up powerful positions in his companies, the emotional toll of facing his own past and exposing himself to the world. And above all, there were the lost years, irrecoverable time during which the children had grown up without truly knowing him. Victor left the courtroom with a twisted expression, not bothering to hide his displeasure. His threats, blackmail, and dirty tricks had not broken Michael, at least not in the way he wanted. Now the former partner faced his own defeat, aware that he had underestimated Michael's determination when it came to protecting his family. In the courthouse corridor, a crowd swarmed around Michael, journalists seeking statements, curious spectators wanting to witness the outcome. He only made a few remarks. "I've done what I had to do to ensure my children's well-being. I'm glad the court recognized their right to a stable environment." Then he stepped aside with a tired look. He had no desire to celebrate in front of the cameras or turn his legal victory into a media spectacle. That had been, in part, the old life he now rejected. When he arrived at the mansion, the atmosphere was different. The children were there, with Martha waiting, brow furrowed, holding her breath. They did not know if the court's decision would allow them to stay with Michael or if it meant another rupture. Seeing him enter, shoulders slightly lowered but eyes serene, they knew something had changed. Michael approached them and said softly, "We can stay together. The judge decided you can be here with me if you want." Their reaction was not an explosion of joy, but rather a relieved sigh. The children exchanged glances, aware that many wounds still needed healing. Martha, serious, watched Michael. She knew this verdict was not a fairy tale happy ending, but the first step toward a future in which they still had to build bridges of trust and understanding. Still, the fact that the legal system acknowledged Michael's efforts was significant. It gave him ground on which to begin building what he had never attempted before, a relationship based on respect and true love. Michael understood that the judge's ruling was only a starting point. Now that he had custody, he had to work hard to earn the children's affection and respect, to show them every day that he was there for them, not out of obligation or whim, but because he genuinely wanted to be part of their lives. The money he had sacrificed, the power he had relinquished, no longer seemed so relevant when he thought about the possibility of seeing them grow up feeling valued, protected, and loved. The courtroom victory, though bittersweet, marked a new beginning. Michael knew that rebuilding the family would take time, patience, acceptance of past guilt, and everyone's willingness to open themselves to the possibility of a different future. But when he looked at the children, he sensed something new. Not complete trust or unreserved smiles, but a look that was less hard, less distant. And for a man who had lived trapped in his own loneliness, that was worth more than any fortune he had amassed. With this determination in his heart, Michael took a deep breath. He now had the space and the opportunity to prove his worth as a father. The legal battle had ended, but the battle for love and unity within his family had only just begun. At least this time, he was willing to give it his all without hiding behind the veil of material success. His life had found a new North Star, his children's smiles, the hope of a home where the past would be left behind and the future, though not perfect, could be lit by the promise of sincere affection. In the weeks following the court's decision, the mansion began to transform into a space where family dynamics started evolving toward less barren ground. The tense silence that once dominated the rooms gradually gave way to the murmur of everyday conversations and the children's still timid laughter. Michael noticed this change as he walked through the halls. He no longer felt only the pressure of his own footsteps on the carpet, but also heard the echo of children's voices intertwining in the distance, creating an atmosphere that, for the first time in a long while, approached the warmth of a real home. The challenge Michael faced was not a minor one. He realized that the court's verdict did not guarantee emotional success with the children. The wound of the past was still there, like a latent scar, recalling every absence, every birthday he missed, every difficult night when he hadn't been there to comfort them. However, something had changed. Now he had the opportunity to mend the damage, to rebuild the relationship brick by brick, day by day. He understood that winning custody was not enough. He needed to win their hearts. The first step was to become involved in the children's routines, the small activities he had once completely delegated. In the mornings, he woke up earlier to have breakfast with them. Although at first it was uncomfortable, they often didn't know what to say, and Michael, still awkward in his new role, tried to comment on the weather or ask them how they were feeling. Over the days, the tension eased. One of the children, the most curious, dared to tell him something about a school project, and Michael listened with genuine interest. Another child, the most reserved one, initially answered only with monosyllables, but gradually his responses grew longer, eventually daring to speak about a book he was reading. Michael received each of these small openings as a gift. Moreover, Michael began to take part in everyday activities, driving them to school, helping them with their homework, sitting on the couch to watch a family movie at night. He discovered that his physical presence was not enough. He had to commit emotionally, pay attention to their reactions, their gestures, their silences. When one of the children was irritable, Michael no longer responded with reproaches or tried to assert his authority coldly. Instead, he asked if something was bothering him, if something bad had happened at school, or if he simply didn't feel like talking. Sometimes he received evasive answers, but other times his empathy encouraged the child to open up a bit more. The kitchen, once the domain of household staff, became a sort of workshop for interaction. Michael, who had delegated meal preparation for years, dared to cook for the children. His first attempts were clumsy. Some dishes came out too salty or undercooked, but they enjoyed watching him struggle with pans and ingredients. Amid stifled laughter and timid suggestions, the children began to feel less intimidated by their father's presence. Even Martha, who passed through the kitchen at those moments, would stop to watch with a mixture of astonishment and a certain tenderness disguised as indifference. Communication also improved gradually. Before, exchanges between Michael and the children were scarce and stiff, as if both sides spoke different languages. Now, although there were pauses and some silences, conversations flowed more naturally. Michael learned not to expect them to tell him everything at once, not to push for immediate answers, but to plant seeds of trust through constant, sincere gestures. Slowly, those seeds began to sprout. One afternoon, one of the children felt frustrated by something that happened in sports class and, instead of shutting himself in his room without speaking, he approached Michael and explained what had happened. It was a brief but revealing conversation. The child had decided that his father could be someone with whom he could share his frustrations. Martha noticed these changes from a distance. Although she still kept some reserve, she began to recognize Michael's genuine effort. He was not the same man she had known in her youth, nor the man who left years ago without looking back. This version of Michael was more humble, more open to self-criticism, more interested in the small details of daily life. The children, in turn, felt this transformation. Although they didn't say it openly, they no longer saw their father as a stranger who entered and left the mansion without stopping, but as someone who stayed, who asked how their day went, who sat down to watch a TV show with them, or who sincerely tried to understand their worries. Past tensions had not completely disappeared. There were still awkward moments, sidelong glances when a painful memory arose, or days when one of the children preferred silence over talking to Michael. But now those instances were part of a healing process, not an unbreakable wall. Wounds do not heal overnight, and Michael accepted that his path to reconciliation would be long. Yet every small step toward mutual understanding confirmed that he was doing the right thing. Sitting in the living room one afternoon, while the children played nearby, Michael allowed himself a few minutes to observe the scene. Before, the mansion had been his fortress, a monument to his corporate success, but a place devoid of human warmth. Now, although the future remained uncertain, he felt that he was getting closer to the family life he had never experienced. There was laughter, comments about the day, subtle approaches. Of course, it wasn't perfect, but perfection wasn't his goal. It was enough to know that the children were beginning to trust him, that they saw him as more than just an uncomfortable presence. This new stage was full of challenges, but also of hope. Michael understood that trust was earned gradually, with consistent actions and constant presence. He realized that he could no longer measure his worth by the size of his fortune or the magnitude of his companies, but by the quality of his relationship with his children, by his ability to be an understanding, loving, and responsible father. The pain of the past was still there, but now it was accompanied by a tangible emotional progress, something they all needed, him, the children, and even Martha. As days passed, the once fragmented family began to rebuild its foundations. There was still a long road ahead, but the outlook was no longer as bleak. Observing his children, Michael envisioned a future together, founded on love, understanding, and the genuine commitment to being a better father than he had ever been. And that vision, so different from the past, filled him with determination and a warmth he never thought he could feel. The afternoon when the children began to speak of their past without Michael, the mansion's garden seemed quieter than usual. It was a mild day, the sun filtering through the leaves, and a light breeze stirring the curtains at the windows. Michael had been helping the children with a small project, clearing a corner of the garden to plant some flowers. Simple, everyday activities that he never would have considered before had now become part of his daily effort to draw closer to them. When they finished, they sat on a wooden bench under the shade of an old oak tree to rest and share a soft drink. The silence among them felt different now. It was no longer that impenetrable barrier of the early days, but a pause that left room for thoughts that needed to come to light. After some light jokes and going over the results of their garden work, the oldest child took a nervous breath and looked at Michael, eyes half closed as if seeking courage in his own breathing. "Dad, do you remember when you weren't around?" The eldest's voice sounded more confident than he expected, but still carried an ancient sadness. "I was small, but even so, I felt the absence. Mom was always struggling alone, you know. Always tired, worried about money, about food, about paying for our school. We were too young to fully understand, but we knew something was missing. You were missing." Michael felt his chest tighten at those words. He looked around, as if searching for an answer among the newly planted flowers and shrubs, but found none. This wasn't a moment for excuses or justifications. He kept his gaze down, letting the eldest continue. Encouraged by his father's understanding silence, the boy went on. "There were nights when Mom cried. We didn't see her directly, but we heard her sobs. Sometimes she talked about you, about how you could have helped or been there. We didn't understand why you weren't. We thought you didn't care about us, that you preferred a life far away." The middle child, quieter, shifted in his seat. Until then, he hadn't said anything, but the conversation gave him the courage to add his own memories. "I remember other kids at school talking about their dads. My dad took me to the park. My dad helped me with my homework, things like that. And I couldn't say anything. I had no stories with you. I tried to imagine what it would be like to have you close, but all I had were Mom's words, explaining that you had gone off to build a successful life. I wondered why the word success didn't include being with us." Those words hit Michael like a cold wave. He remembered his youth, when he believed that the only way to find happiness was through material success and corporate recognition. He had never stopped to think that this success could mean emotional ruin for others, especially his own children. The youngest child, the one who had always been more distant, finally dared to speak. His voice was soft, hesitant, as if every word cost him immense effort. Mom told me you had to work far away, that you had responsibilities. But to me, you were someone I only heard about in stories, almost like a character in a book I never got to meet. When Mom talked about you, it felt like a distant, blurry tale. It hurt to think you existed but weren't here. It was as if you were unreachable, someone who lived only in photos and the past. I asked why you didn't come back, but I never had an answer I could truly understand. Michael felt a knot in his throat. The youngest's gaze was different that afternoon. It was no longer full of frozen reproach, but of a sad acceptance. The children had held these words inside for years, and now they released them slowly, hoping to be understood. Michael looked up to meet their eyes. He did not see hate in them, but pain. Pain and a deep need to close those old wounds. He dared to speak, his voice rough. I have no excuses for what I did or failed to do. In my youth, I thought what mattered was working, climbing up the ladder, making money, building a big name for myself. I thought that by giving you a comfortable life, eventually that would be enough. But I was wrong. I didn't understand what really mattered. You needed me to be present, and I wasn't. I'm sorry. I truly am. Michael's words were not a rehearsed formula. They were the sincere declaration of a repentant man. He did not minimize his absence or try to justify it. For the first time, he looked at his children honestly, letting fall the masks of power and self-sufficiency he had worn for so long. The eldest son nodded, eyes glistening, while the middle and youngest lowered their gazes. None rushed to forgive or console him. They were digesting that confession, that acknowledgement of guilt, that though it didn't erase the pain, at least validated it. It was like building a bridge over turbulent waters of the past. In that moment, guilt consumed Michael, but this time he did not take refuge in denial or escape. On the contrary, he decided to face the reality of what he had been and what he could become. He knew words were not enough, but he also understood that acknowledging the harm done was the first step toward healing. The children, sensing their father's sincerity, seemed to breathe differently. They might not forget the wound overnight, but that conversation in the garden, under the old tree's shade, surrounded by the newly planted flowers, marked a before and after. They had spoken openly about the pain, and Michael had accepted his responsibility. That transparency, painful but necessary, strengthened his determination to move forward. Now he had a clearer goal than ever, not only to draw closer to the children, but to repair, insofar as possible, the cracks his absence had left. He understood that his role as a father went beyond providing material goods or legal protection. His true task was to build a relationship based on understanding, respect, and mutual trust. And for that, these honest conversations were indispensable. As the evening light filtered through the branches, Michael knew this was the start of a new chapter. The pain of the past was still there, but at the same time, there was a tacit promise that, with effort, love, and time, they could transform it into a solid foundation for a fuller, more authentic family life. The weeks following those heartfelt confessions in the garden marked the beginning of a different stage in the lives of Michael and the children. The tensions accumulated over the years had not completely vanished, but something stronger was beginning to grow among them. The shared will to move forward, to understand each other, to try again. Michael, who once immersed himself in his business world, in his relentless schedule and personal interests, now found himself looking for ways to be more present, to show the children his constant commitment. Daily routines were transformed. In the mornings, instead of rushing to his office, Michael took time to have breakfast with the children. He no longer limited himself to a brief, hurried greeting. Instead, he asked them about their dreams, their plans for the day, and genuinely took interest in their school activities. Sometimes, one of the children took advantage of that space to mention a concern, a difficult exam, a classmate with whom he didn't get along, or a new interest that had sparked his curiosity. Michael listened without interrupting, showing that their words carried weight, that their voices mattered. Outings to the park, afternoons spent doing homework together, and small weekend excursions became a natural part of their family life. At first, the children were somewhat wary. They feared this change might be temporary, that Michael would tire of playing the attentive father and return to his closed-off world. However, the more consistent Michael's presence was, the more they realized there was no pretense or obligation, but rather a genuine desire to be involved in their lives. One sunny afternoon, as they left the park, one of the children dared to share a funny story that had happened with a friend at school. Michael responded with a genuine smile, shared a childhood experience of his own, and for the first time felt that authentic connection, free of any sense of forcing it or fear of saying something wrong. The child let out a hearty laugh, and the other two siblings followed suit, everyone relaxing into the simple conversation. Just months before, such a moment would have seemed unthinkable. Conversations at home also began to flow more naturally. While helping with homework, Michael didn't just supervise. He tried to understand each child's difficulties, offered help without imposing it, and sometimes even admitted that he didn't remember how to solve a certain math exercise. That honesty, which once would have seemed impossible, humanized him in the children's eyes. Now they saw their father as someone who could also learn, make mistakes, and put in effort. Martha, watching from a distance, observed these developments with a mixture of surprise and relief. The distrust of the early days gradually faded. Although she still harbored painful memories, she appreciated Michael's renewed effort to become the father the children needed. She noticed how the house vibrated with a different energy, more laughter, kinder words shared, and the heavy tension that once hung over everything had lessened. The children, who had once seemed burdened by the weight of lost years, began to yield ground to hope. They still had insecurities, such as wondering if Michael would remain this way over time, or if he'd retreat at the first sign of difficulty. But with each passing day that he didn't back down, those doubts shrank. Michael was there to help them with a geometry problem, to play a card game, to ask how their day had gone, or simply to listen. The emotional barrier separating them crumbled brick by brick, propelled by sincere gestures, acts, and words. Although the past still lingered in everyone's memory, they now had the courage to face it without being paralyzed by it. They understood that it wasn't necessary to erase those painful memories, but to integrate them into the new reality they were building. Each shared moment, each confession, each laugh stolen from everyday life reinforced the bridge linking Michael with his children. For Michael, this phase represented more than just an improvement in family relations. For the first time in years, he felt truly useful, transcending the role of provider or absent figure. Now he was someone who could console, support, teach, and learn from his children. The satisfaction he felt could not be compared to business success or financial gains. The affection reflected in the children's eyes, the warmth of their laughter, and the ease of their interactions showed him that the true value of his life lay in the family he was forming, not in the material achievements he had once deemed indispensable. Though the path was not without obstacles, and the memory of the past would never fully fade, the present was colored by real hope. With each passing day, the family learned to be more united, relying on sincerity, empathy, and love. In that environment, Michael began to feel truly part of something greater than himself, greater than his ambitions, a family that, without denying the wounds of the past, chose to move toward a shared future. This turning point confirmed that his efforts had not been in vain. While much remained to be done, the promise of building a home founded on mutual respect, honest communication, and sincere affection was no longer a distant idea. It was becoming a reality under construction. For the first time in years, Michael and the children were in harmony, laying the groundwork for a future together, with a firm foundation of understanding and care that they had learned to forge day by day. Afternoons at the mansion had changed dramatically. Before, dinner conversations revolved around figures, pending contracts, acquisitions, and business strategies. Now, as the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows and the family gathered around the table, the topics were different. They talked about school anecdotes, creative projects, dreams, and ideas for building something that went beyond themselves. Michael, who not long ago couldn't imagine his life without business meetings or stock quotes, now found himself enjoying this new pace with a serenity he never imagined. It was during one of these meals, with the children distracted among their plates and laughter, that Michael proposed something different. He had been thinking for days about how to channel his new understanding of life, of family values, and the need to share more than material possessions with others. His children watched him curiously as he cleared his throat and began to speak. "I've been thinking about something," he said calmly. "Now that we better understand what it means to be together, and that we've learned success isn't just money in the bank, I want us to do something as a family. I want us to create a foundation." The children, somewhat surprised, fell silent. Michael continued, "A family foundation focused on helping young entrepreneurs who don't have the resources to start their own projects. We can offer scholarships, mentorships, connections. It's not about making more money, but about sharing the experience, knowledge, and opportunities we have. I want you to participate, to contribute ideas, to help decide whom we should support. I want you to feel that our family's legacy isn't measured only by properties, but by the lives we can improve." On the children's faces, Michael saw surprise, disbelief, and slowly, a spark of enthusiasm. Until now, they had always seen him as a man tied to wealth, power, and business control. But his proposal sounded different. It was an invitation to see the world in another way. He wasn't talking about profits, but about positive impact. He wasn't promising more luxuries, but the satisfaction of doing something meaningful for others. The eldest frowned, trying to understand. "So, you want to use some of our money, what you have, to help people we don't even know?" Michael nodded with a slight smile. "Yes, exactly. People who may never give us anything in return except the satisfaction of knowing we did something good. I think that's the kind of wealth we need to cultivate now." The children exchanged glances. The middle child, more practical, asked, "And how will we know who to help?" Michael shrugged sincerely. "We'll do our research. We can learn about projects, talk to people, study each case. You can help with the selection. Help me understand the needs of the young people who want to start something. I don't know exactly how the process will be, but we can learn together." The youngest, who had always been more distant, seemed fascinated by the idea of teamwork, something that involved his father on a different plane than mere authority. It was an initiative that required everyone's participation, placing them all at the same level as a family, building something for a broader purpose. Martha, listening from the other end of the table, nodded silently. She too understood the significance of this gesture. It wasn't just a philanthropic project, it was confirmation that Michael had learned the hardest lesson of his life. For years, he had amassed wealth without asking himself why, without reflecting on the emotional emptiness around him. Now, he was using that same business capacity to give instead of just take, to create positive change instead of simply accumulating more for himself. The children began tossing out ideas, timidly at first, then with more enthusiasm. The eldest suggested supporting young people who wanted to develop sustainable technology. The middle one thought about something related to education, maybe scholarships to learn a trade. The youngest mentioned rescuing cultural or artisanal projects that young people sometimes couldn't fund. Michael listened, fascinated, mentally noting each suggestion, watching them participate with genuine interest. In that moment, he realized that, for the first time, His children didn't see him as the distant man obsessed with his earnings, but as someone who could inspire them to be better. He understood that the foundation would not only be a tool to make a positive impact on the outside world, but also a space to unite his family under shared goals. A place where they could put into practice values like solidarity, empathy, effort, and respect for those struggling to get ahead. After dinner, the atmosphere at the table felt lighter, warmed by the energy that only arises when people share a common vision. Michael looked at the children, surprised to find that he finally felt at peace. He was no longer the man dominated by his business or the absent father he once was. Now, every decision he made was a piece in the puzzle of his new life, one in which love and family were the pillars, and where true success was not measured in quantities, but in the quality of the legacy he left. He cherished the idea of this new project like someone holding a seed ready to sprout. He knew there would be challenges, that they wouldn't always agree, that each would have different ideas, and sometimes it would be hard to coordinate efforts. But that was precisely the beauty of it, learning together, growing together, and thereby ensuring that the future of his family would not only be comfortable, but also meaningful. And at that moment, he knew that was exactly what he most wanted to leave his children. The sun shone brightly that morning, flooding the mansion's garden with a warm, promising light. Michael and the children came outside carrying a small shovel, fertile soil, and a carefully chosen young sapling. It was a special day, not because it marked a business achievement or a successful contract, but because it symbolized the start of a new chapter in their lives. Off to the side, Martha watched the scene with a mixture of emotion and serenity, witness to the profound change the family had undergone. The chosen spot to plant the tree was a previously unused area of the garden, a corner that had always remained empty, without purpose. There, the children gathered around Michael, excited by the task at hand. Each took turns digging a bit, laughing when the soil resisted or when the wind blew dust into their faces. Michael, unhurried, guided them, letting them do their part and feel the experience of creating something new with their own hands. As the whole took shape, Michael reflected on what that tree represented. It was more than a simple sapling. It was a symbol of reconstruction, of bridges built, of rediscovered love. He recalled the difficult moments, the sleepless nights, the painful conversations, and the tears held back. It had been an arduous journey, full of guilt and scars, but also of learning, of the courage to face his mistakes and take responsibility for them. When the whole was ready, each of the children took a handful of soil and gently let it fall over the tree's roots, as if they understood the significance of what they were doing. Michael, for his part, bent down and positioned the sapling carefully, ensuring it stood firm, orienting it toward the light. Then, all together, they pressed the soil with their hands, sealing a silent pact that from now on they would grow together. A gentle breeze blew, stirring the new leaves of the sapling, which under the sunlight seemed to shine with a hopeful, vibrant green. Michael straightened up and, looking at his children, felt a lump in his throat. They were the same children who, not too long ago, had regarded him with distrust, seeing him almost as a stranger. Now their relationship was based on honesty, mutual commitment, and the presence he had once refused to offer. Their laughter, their expressions, their company, these were the greatest treasures Michael could have ever imagined possessing. No voices of shareholders could be heard, no ringing phones, no pressure from clocks marking the business pace. Only the song of a few birds and the calm breathing of a family learning to truly be one. That moment, frozen in time, was the culmination of a story of redemption and love, a conclusion that, far from closing doors, opened up a horizon to a different future. The imaginary camera pulled away, showing the family next to the newly planted tree. The great mansion, once a symbol of status and distance, now was merely the backdrop where a far more important story was unfolding. The sun illuminated their faces, and on them you could see their determination to move forward, to care for that tree and everything it represented, Michael was no longer the inscrutable magnate, nor the absent father, nor the man trapped by his own ambitions. Now he understood the true meaning of success, one built with joined hands, with intertwined wills, and with the shared effort of loving and protecting those around us. The tree, taking root in the earth, would, over time, become a silent witness to their evolution. It would grow tall and strong, just like the trust between Michael and his children, like the understanding that had sprung from the pain, and like the affection that, little by little, had woven itself among them. The story ended there, with the promise that, although the road to reconciliation had not been easy, the family was now ready to face any challenge, strengthened by having each other as their greatest resource. And that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed this story and could feel the emotion behind every chapter. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss the next content. Thank you for joining me, and see you in the next video.